at any time during just type those questions in that little chat box you see on the console of your screen. We'll do our best to get back to respond to those questions at the Q&A segment. If not, we'll get back to you after the discussion is over. Finally, please stick with us till the end. We'd like you to complete a feedback form at the end of today's discussion. Your input is valuable and appreciated. Thank you so much for your patience. So, we're here to talk about ransomware and endpoint protection. What proactive strategies can you take to protect your organization against the never-ending tide of ransomware? In just the past 18 months, ransomware has emerged as one of the biggest threats on the internet. There were 2,500 attacks in 2020, and an average of 71 ransomware incidents every week this past September alone. Experts project ransomware damages in 2021 to hit US $20 billion, with an 82% increase in ransom payments, averaging $500,000 per incident. What's driving the surge in ransomware attacks really is the rise of the remote workforce in 2020, especially in response to the pandemic, which introduced numerous endpoints for IT departments to manage. Endpoints are a doorway through which your employees access corporate data. The more endpoints you have, the more connections you make online, the more vulnerable your organization is to attacks, and the more risk you expose the company. Coupled with COVID-19-led digital transformation efforts, a massive cloud sprawl as companies rush to expand cloud integration, and a surge of social engineering attacks aimed quite a bit at company personnel, it's clear the threat to organizations are not going away anytime soon. Experts believe remote workers will remain the main target of attacks throughout 2021. According to one report, 65% of employers allow employees to access company applications through unmanaged personal devices, leaving endpoints completely vulnerable to cyber criminals. The best way forward in this cyber war is for organizations to adopt a proactive stance and rethink detection to include the breadth and depth of information you're getting from disparate systems in your networks and data sources from across your IT infrastructure. To better understand and defend against threats, experts are saying you need to update your approach to response, not just detection, to include all the endpoints across the infrastructure during an attack, impacted by an attack, sorry. And to support these new detection and response requirements, you will need to prioritize and improve how systems and tools work together. So, where do we even start? What can you do to proactively mitigate the ransomware threat to your companies and to your corporate assets? Are there best practices to safeguard your company? Well, in the next 30 minutes or so, we hope to share a new approach, some tools and solutions to do just that. But before we get into the chat, I hope you can indulge us. We'd like to invite you to join us right now for a quick poll to get us started. Please take a few moments to complete each poll question as they appear on your screen. These are multiple choice questions, so please take a moment to read them through and answer. Now, question number one, if your organization were to be hit by ransomware tomorrow, could it recover? Yes, no, somewhat, and no idea. Question two, will you pay the ransom? That's a fairly straightforward question. Yes or no. Question three, do you think your organization has access to relevant data to investigate the severity of a cyber incident and determine next steps? Question four, what measures have you taken to minimize the damage an attacker could do inside your network? There are several, you can pick several answers there. You're not restricted to one answer. Question 5, are you confident that backups would remain unaffected by a ransomware infection? Okay. Have we got all the answers in? Okay. Yeah. NPO. Okay. Okay, let me just share the results. Oh, sorry. Can't see. Okay. Can't scroll. Okay. Okay, so sorry about that. We can tell from the responses, most of you are somewhat comfortable with your recovery systems. It's good to know that nobody wants to really pay for the ransomware attacks on your system. I'm not really surprised altogether, but clearly there are issues that we need to deal with as far as incidents when and if they happen. Okay, so let's talk about these issues and have a broader discussion on exactly what's happening in the market space, and let's see where we are with ransom endpoint protection and ransomware. Let's take a step back and look at where we are with ransomware. I want to just direct the question right now to our speakers. Leonard, sorry, Jason, if you could give us a sense of what's really been happening in the space over the last, I guess the last 2 years or so. There's been a surge in ransomware, and we have things like ransomware as a service gaining some traction among cyber criminals. What do you think is driving the uptick on ransomware? I mean, it's not something new per se, but there's been quite a bit of a surge in the last 18 months. Are we doing enough to protect organizations?
Sure, thanks, Sri. So look, I think ransomware has absolutely seen quite a resurgence in the last couple of years. COVID-19 has contributed to that. It's pushed most organizations into a remote working environment where the reliance upon IT assets has increased. It's pushed a lot of compute responsibilities out to the edge, which has resulted in organizations losing some of the control of those IT assets that they once enjoyed when everything was inside of a nice, clean, clear and healthy perimeter. And that's probably one of the primary reasons that we've seen so much ransomware activity over the course of the last couple of years. It's also driven by the fact that ransomware tends to be one of the attack types that most directly aligns financial gain to the attackers with the actual attack activity itself. Meaning to say, an attacker chooses to execute a ransomware attack, there's an immediate monetary gain that they can realize from those activities. So inside of TrustWave, where we monitor and we manage security technologies for hundreds of organizations around the world, we see ransomware attacks on an almost daily basis across our client base. Now, a large number of those attacks are successfully blocked by the security controls that these organizations have employed. But there are some ransomware attacks that still get through the defenses. And the primary reason for that is that ransomware attacks tend to rely upon individuals, people, as one of the weak points within the organization that can allow for successful execution of a ransomware attack. So the best controls can't always overcome the weak link of the human component that often plays a role in ransomware. And that's because techniques, social engineering techniques like phishing and spear phishing and so forth, often tend to be one of the leading vectors that an attacker uses in order to introduce ransomware into the environment. If we look at some of the recent scenarios that we've seen kind of live within our client base, we've had some organizations who, despite having all of the usual controls in place, saw like ATP type activity or APT activity, advanced persistent threat, that resulted in an eventual ransomware infection. So, for example, an incident occurred recently where passwords were compromised from one of our clients' environments off of an unprotected end user workstation out at the edge. Those passwords were then put on the dark web. They were then sold to an individual who used those to gain administrative access into the client's environment remotely, and then introduced a known ransomware toolkit, and used that access to laterally move across the environment and to copy that ransomware toolkit to multiple workstations, and then executed the attack essentially simultaneously across multiple workstations, ultimately resulting in 100 or so systems that were infected inside this client's environment. And subsequently, a pretty significant forensics investigation was performed to address that particular threat. So the ransomware threat is real. It's largely being perpetuated because of opportunistic changes that have taken place in the remote COVID-19 working environment. It's important because attackers see it as a way of very quickly realizing monetary gain. And it's something that requires many different layers of defense in order to protect against. And I think we're all looking forward to talking about that as we go into the discussion today.
Right. Thank you so much, Justin, for that. It's interesting that this issue of the weakest link being the individual is just a recurring theme throughout cybersecurity. Right? It's not something that we seem to be able to get away from. And along those lines, I guess the governments and regulatory bodies have weighed in on the issue as well to, I guess, in a sense, offer some a greater protection for companies as well as the public at large. There's been a lot of legislation around ransomware threats. In some instances, in some domains, they're making it illegal to even pay off the ransoms. So I'm just wondering, and Leonard, I thought maybe you might have some perspective here. How the regulatory framework, how is that impacting organizations when it comes to ransomware, or for that matter, their decisions on what cybersecurity policies to implement, what tools to implement? Is it having an impact at all?
The short answer would probably be yes, but I think that we probably need to step back, or half a step back in that context.
Okay.
And when it comes to that regulatory and legislative environment, we in cybersecurity, we've seen enormous change. And there's a significant amount of complexity obviously introduced when you got legislation and law involved here. We just look back over the last sort of handful of years, there's been significant changes in data breach regulation, privacy, etc. And now obviously there's a lot of discussion around how they can put a framework of legislation around ransomware.
Right.
But we need to be clear here, okay? So the role really around legislation here is first and foremost, it does need to keep pace with the changing world, but it does seem to find itself lagging. So we're always playing catch up with legislation.
Right.
And legislation on its own is not going to be that single stick to bring about total change. We need to understand it has a place to play. It's part of that tapestry of cybersecurity that helps in terms of a holistic approach to protection and so forth. Definitely one thing legislation and regulation does do is it helps organizations make the right sort of decisions and actions by mandating these minimum thresholds or requirements, okay? It does provide some level of clarity, certainty, and consistency around how organizations act, behave, etc., and things like that. But if we look at the legislation that's being banded around, I'm talking about globally, not just in the US or the UK, Australia, everywhere, you can see that the intent of the legislation is very much focused on enabling visibility on these types of actions. And because with that visibility, you have the opportunity to better understand all the methods, the TTPs, the IC, all those sort of things. And when you understand the situation, you're better to take action in that sense. So if answering your question there, about making it illegal, I genuinely have some concerns about it making it legal. I don't think anyone has stepped into that and said 100% we've made it legal, but let's talk about that. Because you put it in context, okay? If an organization has just been hit by ransomware, not only did it have massive disruption to their business operation, it may impact their share price. They're going to have to bring in potentially expenses associated with cleanup, remediation, and they would have made payment. Okay,
right.
And then on top of that, now this sort of regulation says, well, okay, now you've done all that, and you made a payment. It's illegal. They're going to get hit by another regulatory fine for doing so. I think that's a little bit too much. Instead, right. Maybe we should be looking at, okay, if they undertook an assessment and they made the decision to make payment, what about governments coming clear and saying, well, in the context you had to make a payment, we will give you clarity, support, etc., by advocating that those sort of payments become a legitimate tax deduction, so that you can actually offset some of these costs against the actual business. It is, as I said, a complicated area. And I noted with interest, the US Treasury made an announcement about two months or so ago, highlighting the point that if an organization makes payment and the payment was found to go to what they called a sanctioned entity, then that organization and the individual may well be subject to significant fines and penalties up to $20 million each. And that again, the intent makes sense. They don't want people paying money to, say, terrorist organizations and funding it and things like that. So the intent is always critical in understanding how it comes to play. So when we start to get to a little bit of an understanding, and really we've taken a small little insight into some of that regulatory side of it. And for cyber, it really means that we need to be more strategic in our approach on how we actually practice cybersecurity. And it should be predicated on something that Jason talked about earlier, strong prevention, but acknowledging that despite all your best efforts for prevention, bad things will still happen. And hence the mandatory need for the ability to respond and remediate with context.
Right, absolutely. Thanks for that. I'm just wondering out loud as well, we are looking at, various endpoint protection tools when we deal with the whole ransomware situation. And, of late, I think the challenge has obviously been, as I said in my intro, new endpoints. There's so many of them, and so many IT departments are so overwhelmed at the rate at which we've moved into this remote workforce. So tell us a bit more about this move into extended detection and response, right? XDR. It's something that everyone's discussing. I'm not sure how many in the market or in the corporate space are actually looking at these solutions. But could you tell us a little bit more about it, how it works, what it means to organizations facing this threat now?
Oh, certainly, yeah. From my perspective, having played in this space for a long time, there is plenty of good tech out there. Right. However, for me, one of the biggest challenges that we have in practicing cybersecurity is we've fallen to this trap where everything is practiced in a very fragmented and siloed approach. And that generally is brought upon us by the plethora of these single point solution tools. And it's a significant pain for a lot of our cyber practitioners. Really, what organizations should be doing is to start with is asking themselves a couple of questions, okay? Does their technology tool set provide them with that ability to get what I call extreme visibility? That is visibility across your whole organizational infrastructure with context. You mentioned those endpoints now coming into play. You know, the endpoint's not just your traditional desktop. It could be phone, it could be tablets, or any other device nowadays, okay? So you need to have that pervasive visibility right across, as opposed to just that singular, you know, spot view at a particular segment, right? And the second question that they probably need to ask is, does that tool set, all that technology you have there, does it work in concert, in harmony with all the other tools to allow you to achieve that visibility? Because once you have that visibility, you're in a position to then measure the situation and take action. So the right tools actually delivers high fidelity, correlated information and data right across the enterprise in a timely manner. And I mean as near to real time as possible. And for my mind, you know, this is what I love with our XDR, Cortex XDR tool. I call it the Swiss Army knife. It brings that Swiss Army knife capability to your security operations team, allows them to do everything from prevent, detect, and then matriculate into remediation, you know, investigate, etc. And it doesn't just apply to ransomware. We're talking about, you know, any cyber-related threat, attack, or vulnerability. And by working in that type of concert, you're using the same tools for prevent and then investigation and remediate. You compress that time frame between detection and response. Okay, and what a great benefit that brings. You know, there's enormous ROIs. You know, removing that time gaps, returning significant value to your team, your tool sets, your expenses, etc., and of course, protecting your organization. Right.
Thank you for that. You know, I'm just going to pause for a second and just remind everyone, if you have any questions on anything that we've just shared, you know, please feel free to just key it into the chat box you see in front of your screen. Jason, I'm just wondering, following on from what Leonard just shared, could you give us a sense of what are the differences in terms of, you know, endpoint protection? We have EDR, and I think everybody knows that. And if you work with a provider, you have managed detection and response as well. Now we have XDR. How do we synergize all this, if you were a company, you know, into some kind of coherent policy or strategy against ransomware? Is that even possible? Does this replace something? How does this all work?
That's a good question, Sri. I think you know, it would be great if every organization was a blank canvas, so to speak, right? Where we could go in and we could sit down and we could direct the application of tools based on the current threat landscape and start from scratch. But the reality is that, you know, every organization has an investment that's already been made. You know, there is a certain set of technologies that are already present. Usually it's some kind of mixed heterogeneous environment with different vendor tools and these sort of things, right? So ultimately, I think organizations need to look at, you know, what are the primary use cases of each of these technologies and figure out how they can be brought to the table to solve the problem of threat identification, response, containment, and remediation. So I think if you kind of step back, you know, what we're really talking about here is a few different technologies and a few different services, right? You know, XDR, that conversation usually begins with EDR, which is endpoint detection and response, right? Which is an agent-based technology that primarily exists in order to, you know, protect the endpoint, provide a solution for, you know, deep investigation and analysis at the endpoint, and to serve as a control point so that we can actually stop, you know, individual threat actors and threat actions in their tracks. That's what the EDR solution is designed to do. EDR, because of its nature of being threat-centric, being focused on analysis and being focused on control and living at the endpoint, provides a great data point. It provides a very high fidelity set of information about what's happening in the environment. That EDR technology then has the capability of feeding in a couple different directions. One is it could feed into a traditional SIM platform, which is where, you know, historically organizations have pumped all of their log data. They've attempted to do some form of aggregation, maybe a little bit of normalization, and then apply a series of use cases against that in order to derive, you know, either compliance outcomes or threat detection outcomes. And then that SIM tool sometimes can be automated by SOAR and other platforms. But what if you don't go the SIM route? Or what if you do go the SIM route and you combine it with something else? That's when you feed that EDR data perhaps into an MDR solution, which is managed detection and response, which is a services-based solution designed to provide the organization with a combination of both threat detection and containment outcomes, as well as technology management and remediation. And these MDR services, are usually tied to monitoring the technology, managing the technology, looking for threats in real time, and then also combining, something that we call proactive threat hunting with the real-time equation. And that's really about using the EDR tool as a means to look deeper into the client environment, such that we can begin with some type of hypothesis about where a threat might exist based on what the data is telling us. And then we can take a trained, highly skilled human being, a threat hunter, and then guide them towards those assets to root out any attackers that might have gained a foothold in the environment but are unknown to us at that particular point in time. So MDR kind of provides this ability to maximize that EDR investment and complement it with this real-time monitoring, detection, and response component. And then XDR is kind of the place where either the EDR solution or the MDR solution can feed its data to achieve and realize the best threat detection outcomes. We sometimes get questions about, is XDR a replacement, or is XDR a replacement of SIM? Well, no, it's not really a replacement of SIM. It doesn't fulfill the same use case. There's no compliance component, as an example, to XDR. Right. And some of the use case work that we manually build into our SIM platform doesn't get translated over to XDR, because XDR tends to rely more on machine learning and artificial intelligence that is enabled through the normalization of very threat-centric data sources that feed into that platform. And so XDR becomes, you could think of it as a very modern automated tool for threat identification, analysis, and response. And so, the XDR is something that you see even service providers like Trustwave deploying in order to help monitor the environments of their clients and improve the speed to threat detection and the quality of those threat detection outcomes. So, we have, a platform that we've implemented today, which has, some XDR functionality built directly into it, specifically to help accommodate that requirement for our clients. So I think you just kind of step back and you look at all these, swimming in all these acronyms, but the reality is that, they all serve very distinct purposes in the mission of providing comprehensive layered protection that can help organizations better, respond to that growing threat of ransomware and the other multitude of threats that are out there as well.
All right, thank you for that. I'm just wondering, sorry, Leonard, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was going to say that this is why we've partnered with Trustwave, and that they get this the challenge, and they have the mechanisms to absolutely support all of our customers and out there. But definitely, I absolutely concur with a whole bunch of things that Jason said there about the ubiquity of the capabilities of these tools there. Thank you.
Right. I mean, that's amazing information. I was just thinking out loud, though. The question of redundancy comes into play here. Obviously, XDR adopting a very holistic approach to endpoint protection. Are we saying there is some level of redundancy? Will it still coexist with SIEM solutions, or or is it too early really to say how XDR will fit into it? Leonard, what do you think? I mean, is there some element of redundancy here?
Well, I think it really comes back to each organization. It's horses for courses. They need to make those sort of decisions. But at the same time, to answer some of your points you raised there, XDR is a complementary technology. It'll work in concert with your current SIEM. It will be able to ingest that material from your current SIEM or other tools right across your endpoint, your network, your cloud infrastructures. In fact, our recently updated 3.0 release brings a whole bunch of new AI and machine learning capabilities, and it actually expands a lot of our analytics to the cloud and identity realm in particular. So when you look at what it does, it's not about exclusion, it's about inclusion. It's about better integration. For example, we now can ingest a whole host of cloud hosted data, traffic logs, audit logs, third-party security, cloud security logs, things like that. One of the really cool things that we now have built in, and I think Jason can attest to this as well, is we now have a forensics module that is natively built in, the same tool that is used by our Elite Unit 42 unit there. So you can, straight from that same console, do your gathering of historical data from compromised systems, etc., things like that. And the last really cool part out of it is the native ability to now ingest third-party. So we got a third-party data engine. So you can bring in, ingest, normalize, and correlate, and then query and analyze a whole bunch of different data sets from third-party sources again. So that's what I'm saying. Complementary, and it works in concert. That's why I keep calling it Swiss Army knife of security tools.
Right.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, Sri. I think, and Leonard, I think you're spot on with your comments. I mean, the technology is largely complementary because there are certain use cases that just don't get fulfilled in XDR that
right.
organizations tend to rely upon a SIM platform for. XDR generally, doesn't include long-term log archival and storage, whereas a lot of people will use their SIM platform as a place to aggregate all the logs within their organization and meet various compliance requirements about providing long-term storage and analysis of that data. And we don't generally translate compliance-oriented use cases into the XDR environment either. We look at XDR as being a very threat-centric workspace. It's the place you go to understand, with a very, or let's say with a more limited subset of high fidelity data, what's actually happening inside the environment. And you keep it a little bit more limited because you want those machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms to be able to do the best they can, with data that's highly meaningful towards the outcome of detecting and analyzing threats and threat actor movement within the environment. Right.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for that. So speaking of the variety of concerns here, especially with external data sources being ingested into a system like XDR, I'm wondering from the perspective of an enterprise, is this level of integration too complex, too challenging for most organizations? I mean, how are they expected to do this, to manage this, operationally and keep everything in sync? Because clearly there are gaps if you can't quite incorporate the totality of your endpoints, then you've got some vulnerability, you've got some risk. Jason, what do you think? I mean, how do you approach customers who have this as a key concern? Can you manage this operationally?
Look, I would say that everything you just brought up is a great argument against SIEM implementation.
Right.
From the standpoint that SIM's been around as a technology for a long time, and rarely do you ever hear about that super smooth SIM deployment that got completed ahead of schedule. It just doesn't happen. Now, does that mean that the technology is not useful or important? Absolutely not. But it just speaks to the fact that it's really complex, and organizations tend to take a boil the ocean strategy of let's put everything into the SIM.
Right.
I guess I would argue that if you want to draw a parallel to that, and you compare an XDR implementation to a SIM implementation, there's a lot quicker time to value and a lot less complexity in bringing an XDR into play than there is a SIM platform, because what the XDR is taking a smaller set of data that's geared towards higher fidelity threat detection, usually starts with EDR as kind of the cornerstone of that, and then builds out to related technologies from there. And so, once you get your EDR tools rolled out, you then have the ability to start getting a lot of advantage and value out of an XDR deployment that receives data from that EDR implementation. And rolling out endpoints today is not as complex as it used to be in most enterprise environments. And
Right.
I mean, in case in point, there are quite a number of digital forensics and incident response engagements that TrustWave undertakes to deal with organizations who've been compromised, where outcome number one of that engagement is we need to immediately roll out some EDR tools into the client environment to help gain control over what's happening right now. And so, a rapid, emergency driven, EDR deployment then subsequently takes place. And, we've got, usually within, 12 to 24 hours, a significant number of endpoints are already covered, and the organization is getting benefits of the tool from a control perspective, and we're getting the benefits of the telemetry that's coming out of that tool to better understand what's happening in the environment. So I think these technologies are maturing and are able to deliver a much more rapid time to value than what organizations have seen historically.
Right.
If I may add just one more thing, to build on what Jason just espoused there, once you've got that deployed, as he says, and you're getting all that telemetry, one of the wonderful things with an XDR tool like ours is that once it comes into the data lake, it does all that native normalization and correlation for you. And that is a significant, time-saving aspect of these types of technologies nowadays. Jason mentioned the old traditional SIM. Generally, when you brought data into a SIM, you had to find a way to then extract, normalize, and then go in there and then find a mechanism to correlate. Tools like XDR now, they do it for you natively. Yeah.
Right. Excellent.
And that's the enabler behind the AI and machine learning capability, right? That's where the magic comes from, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a distinct advantage that that I think it's a next generation of technology.
Yeah. Right. Leonard, I'm just thinking, if you were to frame this in terms of an ROI discussion, I mean, what kind of additional investment costs are we looking at? For an enterprise looking at, hey, I like what you're saying about XDR. I want to see where it can apply. Because, as we said, there's so many new terminologies coming out, terms, and, it just looks like another attempt to enlarge the security sprawl, right, of solutions that we already have. So could you frame it for us in terms of investment cost and ROI?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question you call then, that context, because that always comes up. For me, if I'm talking to an organization, it's not so much about the dollar side of it. I'm more interested in better understanding their situation. So a lot of the conversation starts with, okay, have you undertaken or performed an assessment or evaluation of your organization's current capabilities, or a gap analysis? You need to understand by performing some level of situational analysis. Where are you now? And part of that, you need to consider the organization needs to consider things like, what's their mission? What are they focusing? For example, do they want to be able to compress that time frame from detection to remediation, and therefore protect the business, making sure it's available, etc.? Okay, great. If that's the case, all right. Now you start to distill down, from a top-down type approach. And then you can start focusing in terms of that old triad, if I can say, that people, process, and technology. Do you have the right resources? Do you have the right procedures in place? Are they up to date? Have they been tested, evaluated? And then, of course, as we've been talking a lot about now, the technology stack. Does it allow you to do all those things with accuracy, with speed, the capacity issues and constraints? So to me, ROI is not as simple as sort of saying, we can give it to you for $8 a widget, and therefore you're going to be miles ahead. It needs to be in the context of what the organization stands for, is trying to achieve, and things like that. Because let's face it, in the end, cybersecurity practitioners, we need to match the operational pace of the attackers, both on the detection and response front these days. They're moving at a far faster speed these days. And therefore, this brings into play the need for things like automation and what Jason was saying there. AI and machine learning capabilities because they become these force multipliers that help drive that ROI conversation equation, okay? That's the way I would actually prefer the conversation to go.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Jason, you have a couple of thoughts on that, or
I think from a service provider context, it's probably a little bit of a different approach or a different way of looking at the question. I think when you talk about managed security services, of which MDR or managed detection response is a subset, these are effectively outsourcing services. And so anytime you have an outsourcing conversation, there is a question of, oh well, is this about staffing reduction, or is it about transitioning responsibilities of the business over to a third party so that we can cut costs? The reality is that yes, that is, I guess, a dynamic of any outsourcing conversation. But in today's landscape, most organizations are not outsourcing to a managed security service provider so that they can eliminate their own security team, right? That they're using that managed security service provider as a means to get a better return on investment of the existing personnel that they've already hired, so that those skilled professionals can add real value towards incident response, or to remediation activities, or to proactive and strategic planning to improve the organization's security posture, rather than spending their time worrying about 24/7 monitoring and these sorts of things. So I think there's that aspect of this ROI conversation. But then the other part of it is a little bit more operational in nature, which really says that when you employ a provider to do something like managed detection and response, where the responsibility is a combination of both managing the technology, monitoring it, and then responding in some way, that means that the organization has the potential to see realized gains in terms of mean time to acknowledge a particular security incident or threat, mean time to detect that there's an actual incident in play, mean time to respond in terms of actually putting compensating controls in place to limit attacker movement and to shut attacks down in process and basically break the kill chain. So these are the types of operational metrics that organizations, through outsourcing and engaging an MSSP, can sometimes either improve, or in cases where maybe the maturity was lacking to begin with, they can introduce the monitoring and metrics-oriented approach of tracking these sorts of things and be able to get into a position where they understand what good is, and then they have an ability to communicate when they achieve better. So I think that's a little bit of a different, services-oriented ROI-led discussion than a technology one, but one that we're very familiar having with our customers at TrustWave.
All right. Thank you for that. Okay, so we've come to, I guess, the end of the discussion per se, and more into the Q&A segment. I'd like to encourage everyone listening in to just, give us your thoughts. If you don't have a question, you have a comment, please feel free to drop that into the chat box. We'll definitely try to respond to it. I have one question here for both our speakers, and I guess it's interesting because there is still some education needed in the market. The question is, what outcomes does XDR provide compared to SIEM? So I think the questioner is actually asking for a breakdown, to compare XDR against SIEM, just to give them, I guess, some sense of what this does versus what they already have. Jason, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think the way I would think about it is, the SIEM solution, typically starts with log collection and archival.
Right.
And it builds on top of that the capability to normalize some of that log data, but it requires, in some case, some manual intervention for parsing and those sorts of things.
Right.
And then it brings about the ability to layer on top of all of that data use cases. And these use cases tend to be, think of things that are created in a natural language. Let's compare this element with this element, or let's compare this element over this time period and take a look at what the outcome is, with the intention of saying, we want to use these use cases in order to identify things that might be interesting from a security point of view, or we want to be able to use those use cases to identify conditions that might be interesting from a compliance point of view. And then we're going to stream those findings to a console and give an analyst an ability to look at those outputs of the use cases and do some crawling through the data sets to better understand what's happening. And then sometimes we'll combine that with some workflow tools so that we can track the activities that we're taking. Right. But there's a lot of customization. There's a lot of manual work, and there's a lot of I guess you could say variability in how the tool can be used, whether you're dealing with threats or compliance-oriented use cases. Right. The contrast to XDR is that XDR is really about saying, I want a tool that is purpose-built and designed for threat identification and analysis. And I don't want to have to worry about understanding and creating all of the use cases that we want that tool to process the data against in order to identify threats. And so rather than having this kind of conversational use case language as the primary means of detection, the XDR leverages that automated normalization that occurs from collecting data from a more limited data set, and then produces high fidelity findings that can be processed in a very threat-centric workflow by an analyst. And so the tool is, it's definitely different than what the SIM provides. It's definitely complementary as opposed to a replacement. And it's one of those things that as the organization wants to mature its ability to identify and hunt down threats in the organization, it's kind of the natural evolution of moving from just a standalone SIM investment to something that's more threat-centric through XDR. And if the tool didn't provide those distinct advantages, it would not be the underpinnings of what a lot of service providers are using to deliver the managed detection and response outcomes that we're bringing to our clients when they subscribe to those MDR services.
Okay. So, sorry, Leonard, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, the way I would simply describe that is it gives you that pervasive, holistic view by collecting all that, the information and rich data, all that telemetry, and that allows you to respond expeditiously with no real-time effects if you want. The other thing I think that also Jason alluded to early in the conversation is this ability to deploy quickly. So you got a speed of deployment that gets you up and ready and in that protection and discovery mode, which straight away pays enormous dividends when you look at the return on those types of investments, if you want.
Right.
But the really cool part, I think, is once you've got something like that deployed, like XDR, you can then overlay it with automation, something like the XOR tool, and then the world's your oyster. You can automate a lot of responses. We talked earlier about those phishing type scenarios of being the bane of many organizations. You can automate them through playbooks because you're just going to actually mine that all that information and data that you're collecting and make it pop. And then all of a sudden, instead of expending hours dealing with a phishing type scenario, it's all handled through automation and that AI and machine learning type concepts, and it squashes everything down. As I said, compress that time frame from minutes, hours into seconds.
Right. Okay, so we have a question here on UEBA. It reads, does XDR have UEBA correlation with network events? Because many organizations are onboarding to the cloud with Office 365 or AWS. How does the cloud affect the customer process in responding and protecting themselves from ransomware and threats? Jason?
Yeah, so look, I think at the end of the day, I would frame it as, the EDR solution is one angle for protecting against ransomware. But EDR is a tool that lives, at the edge, on the endpoint, designed to provide a degree of detection and control over, a single asset. Once we start talking about, moving things into the cloud, the cloud changes a lot of the traditional security models that we've all become accustomed to. And there are a whole host of new considerations that we need to take, that we need to, to really think about when we deploy solutions in the cloud. I think what you're starting to see is, services, like our MDR service and tools like the Cortex XDR, are basically being bridged to the cloud via API, so that we have the ability to get telemetry from those environments, so that the cloud assets actually, behave and appear to the service and the technology, as if they were any other traditional asset within the environment, within the enterprise. And so that gives us an ability to bring the data in, and ultimately visibility of that telemetry is what we require in order to be able to understand where the threat is and where the threat actor may have progressed and moved on to. And then obviously you have a whole host of additional security control point technologies that can be applied into these cloud environments, depending on whether or not we're operating in an infrastructure as a service or platform as a service type environment. Each one of them is going to be a little bit different. Then you have different conversations if you're talking about, containerization versus virtual machines and these sort of things as well. But ultimately, the way I would typically frame it to get the conversation started is it's about getting access to the data. The cloud platform providers have gotten pretty good about opening up the appropriate APIs to give us tools-based access. And then the tools have already matured to a state where we can bring the data in and kind of treat it like another enterprise asset. And that gives us, pretty good telemetry and threat detection capability, even over these multi-cloud and hybrid type cloud environments. Len, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that from a follow-up point of view.
Just again, building on what you just said. So, I mentioned earlier our most recent update, version 3.0, that specifically does what you're just talking about there. We've extended that and deep integration into cloud hosted data, third-party cloud security data, specifically allowing us to bring in and ingest audit logs and your traffic logs, etc. So it's actually operationalizing what you just said there. Okay, and secondly, there's a whole bunch of new enhancements specifically around that the question was asking, the UEBA capabilities in there, and in this particular release, strong emphasis on detecting malicious user and insider threat scenarios are now incorporated into it. So it is, irony, your answer is exactly what we've recently operationalized.
Okay. We have time for just one more question. So I want to just assure everybody we're extending the discussion today for a couple of more minutes. So this question reads: will EDR or XDR help in disruptive ransomware situations where the entire machine is encrypted or rendered inoperable? Typically, EDR will not be able to respond or provide telemetry to the XDR for analysis. How should an organization best detect and handle such situations? So I guess it's a post-impact kind of a scenario here. Leonard, do you have a perspective there?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Actually, it's a very salient question to ask at this point in time. I think we also need to be clear in terms of that question and a ransomware attack. There's a lot of things that happen before they encrypt your data, and a lot of that actions, those telemetries and so forth, are being broadcast. So with a well-deployed EDR technology tool set, you're able to then identify all those different actions that are occurring. Because let's face it, for example, if you look at some of the modes of operation these days, okay, the bad guys get in, then next thing you want to do is they want to move around. So they're going to be moving across your network, okay, whether it's across segments, etc., things like that. Then they're going to do stuff like bring in third-party tools, Cobalt Strike, R-Clone, all those things. They all are indicators that you can pick up on with the right type of EDR tools. And lastly, let's face it, the final sort of thing they do is they start to amass all this data into one location, and it's usually done across segments of your network at unusual hours of the day or night. That's noisy, very, very noisy activity. Again, with those types of tools, you're able to identify the series of what would otherwise be seen as individual events and maybe benign, but when you put them all together, you got context. You go, well, hang on, this is probably a precursor to the encryption happening, and then boom, that
Right.
all fait accompli message that pops up in your screen. So I think that the technology, properly deployed, properly configured and tuned, knowing what you're looking for, and if you don't have it, working with your MDR partners. That's what I think Jason was talking about with regards to that hunting. You're looking for these types of activities and popping in them.
Right. Thank you for that. I think we're running out of time. So I just want to maybe sum up the discussion today by asking both of you to give, maybe give us one key takeaway you think enterprises should take note of in this whole discussion around ransomware and endpoint protection. Jason?
Sure. Look, I guess where I would focus from a one key point of view is, don't be afraid to ask for help. The reality is that protecting against ransomware, same as with almost any other specific targeted threat, requires a whole host of controls to be in place and working in tandem in order to be effective at identifying and shutting these things down before they have a chance to impact the business.
Right.
And again, no matter how many controls you have in place from a technology point of view, you've still got to deal with the individuals who represent a potential risk to allowing these threats into your environment. And so when you ask for help, you can be asking for help to say, I need help to figure out, how do I put a comprehensive, ransomware prevention program in place? And that's going to look like something that feeds right into the organization's DR and BCP plan. Or it might be saying, I need help with, the ability to monitor for these threats, because I'm not convinced that I've either got the right people or enough people or the right telemetry to do that effectively. And that's where potentially, some type of managed detection and response type solution can come into play to help complement the existing security teams with that capability. But ultimately, getting to a posture where you feel confident about ransomware. And I noticed that, the survey results said the majority of our participants were not confident, requires you to ask for some help and put a roadmap in place and then drive towards that roadmap. This is not a silver bullet. One technology or one compensating control is gonna fix the problem. This is a journey, and you probably need some help to figure out where you're at in that journey, define the roadmap, and then execute methodically on that over time.
All right, thank you for that. Leonard?
Sure.
It's perfectly said, Jason. Obviously, have the conversation because it's only through that conversation that you will unpack issues of concern, and we can identify how we can all work together to help each other. And I do believe that's a critical point. This is something we all need to work together to overcome, because the impact of a successful ransomware attack doesn't just hit the organization itself, that singular one. No, it has a profound ripple effect. And if you think about it, at the organizational level, they get hit, okay, not just having to make that payment, should you be in that position, but you got a whole long tail of rebuilding trust with the community, with your partners who may be saying, oh, I don't know if I want to do business because you've already been hit by ransomware, things like that. It has impacts on, you may have cyber insurance, but it impacts the premiums and then everyone else down the track, okay? And let's not forget the biggest issue, the societal impact that it has on all of us, okay? The ransomware payments that potentially go to funding illegal and illicit entities and activities, from terrorist organizations to the drug trade, we really don't know. This is an absolute game that we all need to play together. So have that conversation, as Jason said.
All right. Thank you for that. So we've come to the end of our panel discussion. I really want to thank both Jason and Leonard for a wonderful sharing and enlightening discussion. Really, I think we've all taken quite a bit from this session. In the meantime, for all of you still out there, please, help us along with the e-survey. Just scan the QR code on the screen right now, and it'll take you about 2 minutes to complete it. We really appreciate the feedback. It will help us to prepare for topics in upcoming discussions planned ahead. Again, thank you all of you for making the time for joining us. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Leonard. Until we meet up again for the next discussion, take care and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Another busy day for you after this, Jason?
Always. They never end. It's just nonstop, and it always, it's kind of like the rush to the end of the week, right? When you get to Thursday, it gets busier, and Friday gets even busier, and that's always the way it works. And we've always got maintenance windows and things like that taking place over the weekends as well. So it's just the weekend tends to get busier, which makes it really tough to disconnect. But we do the best we can. We try anyways.